Hello and welcome to the Race and Rights Podcast. This is Sahar Aziz, Distinguished Professor at Rutgers Law School and author of the book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom. I'm also the Executive Director of the Rutgers Law School Center for Security, Race, and Rights. You can follow me on social media at Sahar Aziz Law and learn more about my work at saharazizlaw.com. The Center for Security, Race, and Rights, also known as CSRR, engages in research, education, and advocacy on law and policy that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, Palestinian, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To learn more about CSRR's work, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and follow us on social media at Rutgers CSRR and RUCSRR. And if you find the Race and Rights Podcast informative, share it with your friends, rate us, and please consider making a tax-deductible donation by going to our website, csrr.rutgers.edu, and press the donate button. And please give generously. In today's episode, Noura Erakat, who is a professor at Rutgers University, discusses her book, Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. Professor Erakat offers a new approach to understanding the Palestinian struggle for freedom, told through the power and control of international law. Focusing on key junctures across a century-long arc, from the Balfour Declaration in 1917 to present-day wars in Gaza, Professor Erakat shows how the strategic deployment of law has shaped current conditions. Over the past century, the law has done more to advance Israel's interests than the Palestinians. But this outcome was never inevitable. Law is politics, and its meaning and application depend on the political intervention of states and people alike. Within the law, change is possible. International law can serve the cause of freedom when it is mobilized in support of a political movement. Presenting the promise and risk of international law, Professor Noura Erakat calls for renewed action and attention to the question of Palestine. Let's hear what our guest has to say on a topic that has generated a new social movement among American college students supporting justice for Palestinians.
Thank you for having me. Let me start in this moment right now, which is a horrific moment. We saw yesterday the United States issue its third veto at the Security Council, now in 138 days of ongoing genocide against the Palestinians in Gaza, issuing that veto against the will of the international community, not only the 153 states that have demonstrated their support for an immediate ceasefire as a result of the Uniting for Peace resolution UNGA 377, now invoked twice, not only in opposition of the Secretary General Antonio Guterres' invocation of Article 99, an exceptional invocation to also demonstrate, the need and the will to impose a ceasefire, not only in the opposition of an ICJ ruling that found that this is what Israel's military campaign is not legitimate war, merely featuring violations of war and crimes against humanity, but is in fact a genocidal campaign, and that all states have a duty to prevent genocide. The United States now demonstrates that in the face of all of this political opposition, including Israel saying that it doesn't care what The Hague says, that as a member state of the United Nations, it actually does not care what the highest judicial organ of the international community has to say. It doesn't care what the rest of the international community is saying, that in the face of all that, you have the United States still impeding the will of the international community, demonstrating for many what seems like the absolute futility of international law and international legal institutions, and highlighting what realists say, which is that international law is a fiction. It's merely a battering stick with which the weak pummel the strong with, using a liberal veneer. And so this very scary moment where we're not only seeing an ongoing genocide, but also an impending invasion of Rafah, the last standing city in Gaza, now providing refuge to nearly 80% of Gaza's Palestinian population, where 80 1 in 4 Palestinians is actually starving. We have now learned that 80% of the world's starving population is Palestinian, where we need to send in medical units, water, adequate care, food, shelter. And instead, Palestinians there are bracing for massacre and possible removal, forced displacement into the Sinai, the Egyptian Sinai. And, looking around us, what is international law doing or failing to do? So it's at the very height of this, need, this urgency, together with the frustration at the futility of law, which leads me some years back as a practitioner and then as a scholar to examine the question of what is the relationship between international law and power, and what does it have to tell us about the Palestinian struggle for freedom? And in answering that question, or in seeking to answer that question, I produced Justice for Some, Law on the Question of Palestine, which is the subject of today's discussion, which is unfortunately too germane to what's happening in the world. So I answer that question by concluding that law is politics, that part is true, that law is politics. And politics is a reflection of power. But because we know that power is diffuse and dynamic, that just because law is power doesn't mean that it is inevitable, but instead that it's subject to reinterpretation, it's subject to leveraging. And so the way that I would sum that up is to say that yes, law is power, and to be used in the service of emancipatory struggles, it must be wielded in the service of robust political movements. So think like a movement attorney. The law on its own is not going to yield the outcomes we want. We are not going to go to a court and have the law produce a particular outcome. That court proceeding is incredibly politicized, from the fact that you have a jury that might be influenced by what's circumstances in the world, as well as judges that are either appointed for life, who are seeking their next political position, or judges who are elected, who are also responding to the political moment. You have a promise of a litigious strategy between two parties that are wielding evidence, documentation, and legal interpretation to have a certain outcome. Going to the court on its own will not yield an outcome, because the law unto its own is not a science to be discovered, right? But instead is what critical legal scholars would describe as indeterminacy, that the content of law has no specific meaning, but that it could both, not even a core meaning, but that it can change based on the legal work and based on the material circumstances around you. And that if that is the content of law, then the form of law, which is now in the international legal system that we're bearing witness to, which is, enforcement mechanism that's concentrated in the Chapter 7 authority of the UN Charter that is wielded by the UN Security Council, is encumbered by the fact that the Security Council has 5 permanent members, each with veto power, and that those P5, those veto wielding members, can override the will of the international community, is the source of structure, that this is a structural issue that law cannot overcome. Legal argumentation will not be able to overcome U.S. intransigence in this moment. And so taken together, this is where I say you have to wield the law in the service of political movement and what political movement is doing. Think of the law like the sail of a boat. If you are in a boat without oars, then you don't have movement. But you can have movement if you have a sail. But even if you have a sail, which is the law, the direction that you move in is still contingent on the direction that the wind is blowing. So if the sail is the law, the wind is politics. And I urge, pull up the sail when winds are blowing in our favor, draw the sail when they're in opposition to us, construct a new sail when possible. And so using that kind of theoretical framework, I then map out the history of the struggle for Palestinian liberation as told through the relationship between law and politics between 1917, in the aftermath of the First World War and the establishment of the Balfour Declaration and its approval by British Parliament, to 2017, where we see the large-scale attacks against Gaza come to full fruition, but those seeds are born in the West Bank, actually, in 2000, in the moment of the Second Intifada and the transition from occupation to warfare. So let me tell you some key takeaways from that will be helpful in thinking about the present. The primary takeaway that I want folks to think about is that the Palestine Mandate, which is a Class A mandate established in the aftermath of the First World War and part of the League of Nations mandate system that it's established to administer the transition of the territories of the vanquished territories of the Turkish and German empires and to transition them to independence, stratified as Class A, B, and C. Palestine is part of this Class A mandate. But even as such, it's treated in distinction from the rest of the Class A mandates, primarily from Transjordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, and it's treated in distinction because of the articulation of the Balfour Declaration, which designates Palestine as a site of Jewish settlement and regards the Palestinians as who they are by what they're not. So they're not even, this majority of the population in the early 28th century, which is 90% of the whole, is described as non-Jewish, right? Even in this moment, and described in the Balfour Declaration as having their religious and civil rights protected, but not their political rights protected. In doing so, I describe this as a colonial erasure, a juridical erasure of Palestinian peoplehood, which marks them as, maybe a population, a minority that needs certain protections, or as Zionists continuously insist, as an Arab population that can be absorbed anywhere in the Arab world, but not as a political community with the right to self-determination, thus constituting a juridical erasure and a denial of their peoplehood. Now, the Balfour Declaration is nothing but colonial, diktat until it's incorporated verbatim as the preambular text into the Palestine Mandate, which regulates the management of the Palestine Mandate in 1922 until, obviously, we see until 1948. Once it's incorporated into the mandate, it now becomes international law and policy. So it's not merely what the British mandatory power wants or desires. Now it becomes a part of international law and what the Permanent Mandates Commission has to balance. They both have to balance, right, the protection of the Palestinians as described as minorities, as well as the mandate to establish Palestine as a site of Jewish settlement. In looking at looking at the actual material, what they do is they prioritize Jewish Zionist settlement instead. In so doing, what this amounts to is what I describe as a legal exception, something in law known as sui generis, Latin for unlike anything else, which, theoretically has many different explanations how we explain exception. Let me just give you a crude explanation. On the one hand, some would describe this as a zone of lawlessness where law doesn't apply. I take a different tack on it and explain that this is actually a site of lawfulness. Right? That saying that there is an exception is to insist that there is a distinct fact pattern so unique that no legal analogy or precedent applies that then authorizes or provides the authority for a power to create new law where they insist no law exists. Right? And so as form of legal exception or this sui generis mandate, right, it allows Britain as the mandatory power to negate the very articles of the League of Nations Charter, which, shapes the regulation of the mandates that includes you shall not make decisions that are contrary to the wishes of the local population, that you shall not take on any other obligations that contravene the obligations of bringing this population to self-determination, and so on and so forth. What appear initially as violations of those laws under an exceptional framework become compliance with it. And we see that precise language when this comes up to the UN Special Committee on Palestine in 1947, where it now has to decide, what do you do with Palestine, where the British in the aftermath of the First World War are retreating, and where the Palestinians are seeking self-determination, but where Zionists are also insisting upon a state. And in the special committee, even though the only legal possible outcomes, according to compliance with law, international law, would have been a UN trusteeship over the mandate, or a Palestinian freedom with strong protections for the Jewish minority, what UNSCOP instead proposes is what we know as 181, General Assembly Resolution 181, which is partition, to establish a Jewish state and an Arab state, not even a Palestinian state, in contravention of international law, which the committee describes as okay because of the sui generis nature of the mandate. This exceptional framework continues to the present to define the status of Palestine and our inability to overcome that exception to regulate it, even in the present moment, in what I describe as Israel making a bid for an exception to the prohibition on genocide. So in chapter one, I'm establishing that exception, and I plant the seed for it, but we see it in the regulation of the occupied territories, which are supposed to be sui generis and not occupied, but disputed. And therefore, in chapter 2, I demonstrate how Israel actually is not, most people, and I'm sure people in this audience would say, Israel built settlements in contravention of occupation law, specifically Article 49, subsection 6 of the Fourth Geneva Convention that prohibits the settlement of civilians into territory that a military belligerent occupies. And yet, to the contrary, what I show is that Israel is not building its settlement in contravention, in spite of international law, but precisely because of it. Because they have constructed a legal argument that both permits their presence as an occupying power and simultaneously allows them to evade the strict regulation of occupation law, is why we have this monstrosity in the West Bank today, in particular, because they withdrew their settlements and settlement infrastructure from Gaza in 2005. They'll maintain effective control and therefore remain an occupying power in Gaza as well. Chapter 3 is the most hopeful, because it demonstrates the height of Palestinians using the law as movement lawyers would effectively in order to advance the Palestinian national liberation struggle. This is where we see the PLO establish itself as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people, and in so doing, counter their erasure in the Balfour Declaration to basically establish their juridical status as a people with the right to self-determination. This is also the moment when we see the passage, the amendment to the Decade Against Racism, and the inclusion of Zionism everywhere apartheid, colonialism, and racism appear, to basically condemn Zionism as a form of racism and racial discrimination in Resolution 3379. This is also where we see the PLO participate with the non-aligned movement to establish that guerrillas are not terrorists, but are actually combatants, as they represent nation sovereigns and have the right to fight, as enshrined in the first and additional protocols of the Fourth Geneva Conventions passed in 1977. Obviously, so this is the height. But I also show its limitations. It has a lot to do with Egypt, as led at that moment by Anwar al-Sadat, in seeking to recoup the Sinai Peninsula, aligns himself with the United States and therefore undermines the possibilities of what Palestinians and the rest of the Arab world could have done in this moment. And then I move. Chapter 4 is thinking about Oslo. There, suffice it to say that I start that chapter by wanting to basically translate the legalese so that people can understand why Oslo is actually horrible. But when I read the documents through and through, it became clear you don't need to be a lawyer. You just need to be literate to understand that. So instead, I shifted to answering another question, which is not how it's bad for the Palestinians, but rather why would the PLO enter into this knowing that it was so bad for Palestinians, and how the Israelis get away with it to basically establish a sovereignty trap, which is where Palestinians remain today, a sovereignty trap of derivative sovereignty, a form of autonomy that people understand as reservations, Black homelands, Area A, right? Whereby Palestinians are basically subject to perpetual domination, whereby they're only eligible for certain privileges so long as they're compliant and seen as good natives in the eyes of their colonizer, Israel, and the colonizer's patron, the United States, but where they're never eligible for freedom. Statehood is never on the table. Oslo never promised statehood. Anybody who is an avid two-stater, I am not, but anybody who is an avid two-stater should be as equally opposed to Oslo as I am, because it is where it is actually what suppresses and preempts the possibility of a Palestinian state. In chapter 5, I basically explain the present in this moment, where Israel shifts at the start of the Second Intifada from a framework of occupation to outright warfare. So whereas under occupation law, Israel usurps the right of policing in order to, for example, the application of martial law means no right to assembly, press, administrative detention, retroactive laws that can be applied, curfews, restriction on movement, right? Not in 2000, we see Israel shift not only from occupation, but now add the dimension of warfare, where in addition to martial law, it can now shoot to kill, drop bombs, extrajudicial assassinations, and now claim both the right of usurping police powers as well as the right of military force against Palestinians under its occupation within the language of law. I explain this because Israel is claiming that its conditions in the occupation in the Second Intifada is sui generis yet again. That its confrontation with Palestinians is unlike anything other. And so it's neither a civil war because it doesn't want to acknowledge that Palestinians live under its jurisdiction in an apartheid regime, nor is it a war of liberation because they do not want to exist that Palestinians are a nascent sovereign. Instead, they describe it as an armed conflict short of war and give themselves the right to establish new law where they insist that none exist. And this is where we see now a redefinition of international humanitarian law, including what I describe as the shrinking of the category of the Palestinian civilian, so that we have less and less civilian Palestinians who count as civilians, which is why Israel can say that a death toll of 29,000 is not disproportionate or excessive, or argue, in contravention of additional protocols and irregular combat, that all hospitals and universities are now legitimate targets because of the possibility that there might be a tunnel network underneath. Understand that this is all a redefinition of humanitarian law, that Israel is not only waging this amount of violence because it can as a power protected by the United States, but it's also doing it in the language of law. And it's fighting that battle in defining what is legal and what is not. So in the conclusion, when I concluded this book, and I finished writing in 2018, it comes out in 2019, and I had a Palestinian futurist vision of the future. I had a vision where Palestinians define our liberation struggle not by, just the return of Palestinian refugees as the culmination of that liberation struggle, but understanding that return is the beginning of our liberation struggle. Once returned, how do Palestinians imagine a future for themselves, for this new, it's a Palestine of 2024, not of 1947. We're not going back. We're going forward to the future. And so in that imagination, how do Palestinians create a possibility, a home, a future that is more promising and irresistible, right, to Jews than Israel promises them? And so I imagine, how does an anti-racist proxies allow us to imagine our struggle as a united struggle against white supremacy, of also for Jews who are, face white supremacy, anti-Semitism is stemming from white supremacy, overcome that as well. The same way that Zionism is an embodiment of white supremacy and Palestinians are overcoming that. I have to say that in this moment, I'm not sure. I'm not sure that is not, as I watch Israeli news media, as I see regular people, right, rallying to kill more Palestinians, as I see pundits say that they can't sleep at night unless they see a Palestinian home bombed. Unless, when I listen to people who are talking about the removal of Palestinians as necessary and basic, and describe it as voluntary migration as opposed to genocide. When I see artists who are having children sing songs about the decimation and the pummeling of the Gaza Strip, in this moment, I think that we are thinking too far ahead to imagine that future when we need to really be contending with the present of how do we overcome fascism. And fascism in a society that has become celebrated and protected under the banner of anti-discrimination and anti-bigotry, which is basically also not dangerous just for Palestinians, obviously, but dangerous for the rest of the world, as we see fascism, become fashioned as a right. And as a framework for liberation for people to survive, which is what many fascists have told us. It's what white nationalists tell us. Right? That this is just a form of their European sovereignty. They have every right to govern in the form of their sovereignty as any other people. When Richard Spencer says that Israel offers a model of sovereignty for the rest of Europe. Or we see Modi's India describe, Hindutva or Hindu supremacy as a form of a national right of sovereignty, even though it's literally continuing a settler colonial expansion project in Kashmir, as well as genocidal violence against Muslims in India. That this is not just a threat for Palestinians, but this is a global threat for all of us as we're contending with this future. And so rather than thinking just how do we resolve this issue, my primary question has become, how do we overcome fascism? How do we overcome the way that it's become attractive to people as a salvation forward that is based on a mutually exclusive equation that only some of us will survive, so some of us must die. In this case, many of us are dying, as opposed to an equation where all of us can survive, and understanding that is the only way forward. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Erakat. That was there was a lot to think about there. And for those who haven't read her book, I highly, highly recommend it. Justice for Some, Law and the Question of Palestine. I just finished rereading it, and so I wanted to ask you a few questions, mainly for purposes of the audience, which is a mix of law students, lawyers, law professors, and people who are not in the legal profession, just so that we can unpack and appreciate the important statement you make about how law can be manipulated and used to oppress. And so a few things that kind of two main questions. The first was, you talk a lot in the very beginning of the book about the law of return and the nationality law. And then there's the more recent law, I believe, is it called the nation state law that was recently passed. And so could you explain how Israel uses its own domestic laws to create what many human rights lawyers and advocates have said is an apartheid state, or at least is an ethno-nationalist state, and also an occupation? And so, well, let me restate that. You've got multiple things happening at the same time, right? You've got Israel saying we're not occupiers. So there's the legal dispute there. Then you have Israel saying we're not an apartheid state. So there's a legal dispute there. And then you have these laws that clearly create an ethno-nationalist state, especially in the quote unquote kind of formal borders of Israel. Can you just explain how Israel has used its domestic laws to produce what many human rights lawyers and the United Nations and international organizations are saying, these three things are happening at the same time: apartheid, occupation, and ethno-nationalist state?
Absolutely. So one of the tactics that Israel has used historically and into the present is this fragmentation, geographical and juridical, of the Palestinian people, so that we imagine that these are three distinct problems. That within Israel has a problem of reaching, a meaningful equality for the Palestinian citizens of the state, and therefore Israel is no different than any other state, including the United States, where American blacks, for example, don't have equality. And then in occupation, in the West Bank and Gaza, that's a different issue, and for the liberals, even for the liberal Zionists, that they just need to end occupation, but in the Gaza Strip, that this is a military national security issue, and in the diaspora, it's something altogether. This is a tactic to fragment the Palestinians juridically and geographically in order to say that these are distinct topics and cannot be considered as part of the whole. Well, one of the things that apartheid helps illuminate is that, in fact, it's a singular jurisdiction that extends from the Mediterranean Sea to the River Jordan, and that it's part of a whole. And if we examine it even further, then you can see in the Palestinian intellectual and political tradition that they've been saying that since before even the onset of military occupation in 1967. And so here you pinpoint where that begins. When I describe these laws of law of return and the citizenship law, also known as the nationality law, I am basically trying to lay out the legal infrastructure established in the direct aftermath of the state's establishment in 1948 that basically is the anatomy of an apartheid regime, right? What is apartheid? Apartheid is a legal system that, creates a series of policies and laws with the intent to dominate for the sake of a particular racial group over another racial group, right? And so there's a lot to be said there and unpacked, and also my disagreement with the recent apartheid reports, but let me just stay on that. How did Israel do that? Well, number one, its first act of government was to adopt almost verbatim Britain's emergency law regime that it applied across its colonial geography, from Jamaica to Malaya to Kenya to India, including in Palestine from 1936 to 1939, which basically suspended all civil law in order to crush native revolt, right? Israel adopts this as its first act of government, but applies it almost exclusively to the Palestinians, which creates a regime of exception. Palestinians are basically policed as an exceptional internal population, therefore racialized as other from the very beginning. Even though the martial law regime is removed in 1966, the emergency regime remains until the present. Also, in the next laws that it applies are the law of return. The law of return establishes Jews as a juridical category. Why is this significant? Because this is not just Jews who understand themselves as not more than a religious community, who understand themselves as an ethnic community, as a people, right, in community all over the world, but this goes further in establishing Jews as a national category. And as a national category, have a right to the land, to the territory, to citizenship, to homes, to housing, right? To those rights. And in that law of return basically says that any Jew anywhere in the world babies who don't even know what Israel is, have more rights to this land and to citizenship than the Palestinian who is living there for generations, even before the state was established. They establish Jewish nationality as an extraterritorial category that unlike other jus sanguinis frameworks of citizenship, right? Citizenship through blood as opposed to territory, that unlike other categories of jus sanguinis, you don't have to demonstrate any territorial relationship or any family relationship. It's why Professor Deir Ali describes it as analogous to whiteness as a category, that will allow you immigration and the right to settle, right? And then the next, and this comes consequently with the denationalization of Palestinians who now become stateless and are denied the right of return as established by customary law, human rights law, as well as General Assembly Resolution 194. Now together, add to this what's known as the nationality or citizenship law. And now we have two categories. We have a category of nationality or Jewish nationality and a category of citizenship. Citizenship, as it was defined and passed, only allowed citizenship for Palestinians who remained in Palestine, did not flee for shelter, did not leave and come back, who were not internally displaced, right? It was to a limited number of those Palestinians who received citizenship All of this together constructs, this architecture that I'm describing of the two tiers, the racial groups. There's a racial group of being a Jewish national and an Israeli citizenship, which gives you access to land, citizenship, housing, employment, right? So in Israel, you don't have to say things, you can discriminate. You don't have to say no Arabs welcome or no Palestinians welcome. You can say other things like military service required, which becomes a smokescreen. Anyway, or you can have this other category of citizenship only, which is a second-class form of citizenship that's attenuated and limited, that forms together with another series of laws, including most recently the nation-state law that established Israel as an apartheid regime. The nation-state law, in short, says the quiet part out loud and says that only Jews have the right to self-determination on the land, which means that they do not recognize that the Palestinians are a political community. They're denying that they exist at all, and they do not recognize that they have the right to self-determination there. They have basically said, this is an apartheid regime. We will rule, whether we're in majority in numbers or we're a minority, we will rule over these people who will have no right to their own state, nor a right within the state as citizens, nor a right to their own, to indigenous, governance, the return of indigenous governance. And instead, we'll just have apartheid that we have the world accept in the name of a Jewish state. And so what we see in the Gaza Strip today is Israel trying to resolve that issue by reducing the number of Palestinians even further in order to reduce the contradictions therein, but they're doing so through genocide.
We've heard a lot of what I think is hysteria and misrepresentation and bad faith attacks on Palestinian communities, Arab communities, Muslim communities, Jewish American communities, particularly those who are critical of Israel and the Israeli government and the Israeli military, and effectively around the term from the river to the sea. But as I was reading your book, and as I'm listening to you now, I can't help but wonder, who is it that really wants complete domination and complete control from the river to the sea in a way that in effect or in practice is committing genocide, or at the very least apartheid or occupation? While there's certainly truth to the definition of that term in the 60s and the 70s being controversial, right? And I welcome kind of what that term meant in the 60s and 70s, but we are now in 2024. So there's also this bad faith attempt, at least what I see, is trying to pull us back into a time that was when circumstances were very different. But in 2024, right, what does from the river to the sea mean for the Israeli government and for the right-wing Israeli politicians? Because I'm concerned that Americans don't really understand that from the river to the sea, to the extent that it has genocidal intent and genocidal practice acting on that intent, may actually be a much more serious and realistic problem, both discursively and legally and militarily, from the Israeli government, not from Palestinians. So I wanted to kind of use this opportunity for you to comment on what I think is also a manufactured political crisis for the purpose of quashing this social movement for the liberation of Palestinians legally and normatively.
Okay, I'm going to answer that question really quick in 3 parts. The first part is just direct response to your question. What do Israelis mean and how do they use it? If you're watching the ICJ proceedings right now for the advisory opinion on the legal status of prolonged military occupation, there was an entire argument being made by the Palestinian legal team that demonstrates the outright intent by the highest levels of government to basically have singular Israeli jurisdiction from the river to the sea, that it is only Israel. And that, this is redundant when you have a nation state law that said the same, and redundant when Israel is saying there will never be a Palestinian state. Right? So one, we have to understand if that's really serious, where should we be most concerned about it? The second is the legacy of how Palestinians are using it. When Palestinians say it and they continue to have these decolonial futures, they have intended and they have made clear that they have sought a future of liberation from the river to the sea for all peoples. That unlike what Israel has insisted on doing, which is denying Palestinian freedom, which is removing them through outright ethnic cleansing, not only in Gaza, but in the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, even within Israel proper. And there will be tomorrow on Jadaliya Palestinian Context Series, a panel from Palestinian citizens of Israel who will discuss, Palestinian citizens of Israel right now can't even like a post on social media because they risk arrest, right? That when Palestinians are not the ones denying freedom and threatening expulsion and pushing people into the sea. That when Palestinians historically and in the present have said that, they have imagined a future for everyone without domination, where Jews belong, but Jewish Zionists cannot be masters of the land and of the people in it, which is this equation and this outcome that we're seeing now. And then thirdly is to echo what you said, Sahad, this is manufactured hysteria. This, in the face, and it fits where we're at in the United States, where the greatest harm has been to Palestinians, Arabs, Muslims, and people who appear like them, right? As they're attacked with chemical weapons on university campuses, as they're run over by cars, as they're stabbed in their homes, as they're surveilled, as they're hit with lawsuits, as they lose jobs, as they're punished for calling for peace. And yet you have congressional hearings that are examining the insecurity of Jews in the United States. It's the height of gaslighting. The fact that university presidents are forced to resign on a hypothetical genocide, while a genocide that's taking place is not addressed at all, when on 100 days of this genocidal campaign, President Biden, who is part and parcel of this war, puts out a statement that doesn't even mention at that point the 10,000 Palestinian children who had died. And so you see that all of this is basically constructing for us manufactured, problems, so that it's a tactic of distraction. It's a tactic of distraction. It's gotten so bad that those who are calling for ceasefire, literally the anti-war activists, are being accused of anti-Semitism, for being anti-war activists, for calling for an end to genocide. And I have to emphasize to the audience watching, I won't take this seriously. The only way to combat this kind of violence, this is discursive violence that is supported by the state apparatus of repression and impunity for those who are committing violence, right, is to continue to dissent. It's when it's the more of us that get arrested, the less space for us there are in jails. There is no way to take this seriously. When we have members of Congress, Andy Ogle yesterday on camera emphasized that all Palestinians should be killed. All Palestinian children should be killed. These are explicit, violent, genocidal statements being made. And yet then we're being taxed on how do we make people feel when we're demanding freedom. So it is a moment of indignation and frustration. It is a moment of, everything, all the quiet parts are being said out loud. It is a moment of deep frustration. And I think that we meet that moment in our unity, in our protest, in our belief that we are not the first to go through this, that Western civilization has been forged on such violence and genocide, and that we are part of a legacy and a tradition that is planting seeds for the future that's far, far, far more optimal than what we see available to us right now.
Yeah, thanks for that. I can't help but put a plug in for my book, The Racial Muslim, When Racism Quashes Religious Freedom, because while you were writing your book, I was literally trying to understand why it was so easy to vilify Muslims, whether, whatever their origins were and whether they were in fact Muslim or not, or whether they were even religious or not. So I think that this this vilification and this dehumanization of Palestinians is highly connected, and you can't really understand it without understanding how Islamophobia works, as well as many of the other forms of systemic and structural racism against other minorities, including Native Americans and African American communities. So I hope that your talk, your analysis, and what's happening today is showing its evidence to particularly our university students, our law students, that what you're learning about in the past is still going on. Mm-hmm. And when it's the liberal approach to systemic racism and to structural inequality is to just study it as a historical issue and not as a present continuation in a different form, right? And in some extent, a different degree, but it is still the same structures and systems of inequality. So I hope that this is illuminating. And I also can't help but just remind the audience that, the Center for Security, Race, and Rights has also been targeted. And I think the fact that we will continue to do our work and we will continue to defend academic freedom, we will continue to defend free speech by practicing it. And for those in the audiences who are so quick to believe that, all Arab states are authoritarian and all Arab people are authoritarian and despotic, the things that Professor Erakat just described about the experiences both of Palestinians who are living under occupation or in an apartheid state or with Israeli citizenship are many of the same things that citizens in bona fide authoritarian states in the Middle East have also experienced. And so this concept of Israeli exceptionalism just falls flat when you look at the facts. So I would just hope that we stop with the Israeli exceptionalism and we study and analyze that state like we do any other state, and that we're just as willing to critique it like we do any other state, including the state we live in, based on our principles and based on norms and laws that we believe make, the world a more equal and fair place. So let me field a few questions. With regard to the two-state solution issue, or so-called two-state solution, we have a couple of questions here, which I'll just read verbatim, and then you can choose how you'd like to answer. So one attendee states, I favor a two-state solution, but if we favor a one-state solution, must we not adopt a multinational federalist approach, preserving not only the fundamental individual rights, but also the collective right of self-determination for both peoples? Both peoples now have a national identity, and both have collective rights to specific institutions in their respective languages. In answering that question, perhaps build off of your comments about Oslo and about, where does the so-called two-state solution proposition, what's the status of it in light of the genocide that Israel is engaging in Gaza, and also the various forms of violence that it's been engaging in the West Bank?
Yeah, this is a really big question. So I'm going to try to answer it in multiple ways, and I hope that you choose the one that appeals to you based on the analytical point of departure, right? The first one is to say what people who emphasize the two-state solution are doing, right? This is just one approach, okay? I'm going to approach it in many ways. But one approach, that those who are emphasizing a two-state solution, one, that's even wrong way to talk about it. There is an Israeli state. It's been acknowledged and recognized since 1949 as a UN member state and recognized by the PLO since 1988. It's not in contest. The only thing at issue has been a Palestinian state. And insofar as those who want this state, what have you done in the past 3 decades, especially the liberal Zionists and those in the administration who say that they want two-state or Palestinian state? They don't even say a Palestinian state. Where is the pressure that you have applied? So, for example, J Street, established as the alternative to AIPAC, wants a Palestinian state, but has also gone full force against any attempt to apply sanctions on Israel or accountability. They have literally, J Street, this huge apparatus, has descended on university campuses to overturn and append divestment resolutions. They have opposed the efforts to condition U.S. military support for Israel. They want no accountability to Israel, and they want a Palestinian state. So I want those first and foremost, that approach, that anybody who says this one needs to start not advocating for two states, but advocating for a Palestinian state and advocating for all the means and measures that would do that, including the end of Oslo, which is part of the problem because it's a sovereignty trap and never promises a state. Even today, if you were listening, the United States was one of the only states that opposed the Palestinian argument in front of the International Court of Justice and said they are arguing against occupation. They say that there's no occupation, but they want a two-state solution. It's a trap. It's basically the maintenance of a status quo. So let me put that first to those who are most avid about this. Think about it differently. Ask a different question. Know that Oslo never promised a Palestinian state. It wasn't even born dead. It wasn't on the table. Oslo was an autonomy framework. Oslo is a proposal for reservations, and we have that. Oslo has succeeded in doing that. All right? So that's number one. Number two, if whatever outcome that you want, right, whatever outcome that you want can't only fixate on this political future, because what that does, it says that Palestinians have to answer very clearly with a blueprint of what is the future and what would happen to the Israelis, what would happen to the Jewish Zionists in this future before anybody agrees that Palestinians deserve freedom. And while I have empathy for people who may think that way, I also think that it's quite obscene because it accepts that Palestinians will remain unfree. And that is okay until they can come out with a blueprint that makes everybody around them comfortable. That somehow that is okay. And that equation needs to be flipped. Palestinians don't have to describe precisely what that blueprint is to be free, because every day is a day of unfreedom, is a day of racial colonial domination, is a day of native elimination in the form of genocide, as we're seeing. Everything theoretical that we don't want to happen to Jews, Israel is doing to the Palestinians. And yet we're mincing words to say that, yes, but wait, before we consider an alternative, we have to know exactly what they're going to do in the future. So what is happening there? What is the racial work doing that we can dehumanize Palestinians and subject them to this condition to even ask that question? And then finally, a third way to think about this, that I would approach thinking about this, is, look, in order to approximate whatever in the day after, that there has to be a rights-based approach that establishes the rights of all people, and then a political solution that thinks about how do we organize everybody based on that rights-based approach. And so one of the ways the way that we have thought about Palestine all this time is to center Zionist settler sovereignty as the ultimate priority, around which, people can get the crumbs once that's taken care of. And the thing that I propose in the book is flip that equation, because that's mutually exclusive. Versus if you imagine Palestinian freedom and return, around which everything else gets recognized, then we have a place where Jews belong. Jews can belong, where everybody does belong, but where they are not the masters of this land. And for people who want to nitpick on that, I'd rather have an honest conversation about the virtues or the lack of Zionism as an answer to the Jewish question. And there, I'd rather have that conversation than have this really distracting conversation about one state or two state, and instead let's have a real conversation. Is Zionism making Jews safer all over the world? Are Jewish Americans who are leaving Hyde Park in Chicago to live in a Jerusalem settlement more safe? Please tell me. How are they more safe? How are the Palestinians that they've displaced more safe? You have to be honest with yourself that that project is literally why Palestinians are being removed from the Gaza Strip right now. Why they're being pushed into the Sinai is to make more room for settlement for Jewish Americans from Hyde Park and from Park Slope and from San Francisco. These things are not unrelated. So let's not take it to this level of abstraction where you're realizing what's at stake and who are we making more safe. So yeah, I'm happy to discuss whatever and to produce more readings of people who might not be there and find my passion around this strange because they're hearing these questions for the first time. But you realize we're witnessing genocide, not the first one, but the first one that's being live streamed to us. And we are failing to stop it because we have to tend to feelings. And as a human rights attorney, despite the fact that all human rights, are necessary, there's a hierarchy of rights. And bodily integrity is the height of this hierarchy. And feelings are the lowest of them.
I think you very concisely also identified another phenomenon that people aren't talking about enough, and that is the white privileging and white fragility of Jewish American communities, and the way in which, in this particular political context, if one were to examine or do some comparative analysis between anti-Black racism vis-a-vis whiteness, right, and white communities, as race is socially constructed. And I think that literature has been quite well documented, and people now understand this concept of what white privilege is and white fragility, which is all about feelings of the white privileged group, and to hell with the bodily autonomy, the liberty, the life, the dignity, and the physical safety of Black bodies. And I would urge people to think about that paradigm or that frame and apply it to the Jewish American community versus the Muslim American, specifically Palestinian American, but that tends to include Arab and Muslim communities of Middle East origins, and just examine how those communities here are treated when there is a disagreement, when there is a debate, when there is a difference of opinion or legal analysis, and how easily vilified and dehumanized, right, the Palestinian, Muslim, and Arab communities are, and how the Jewish American communities are privileged and their voices are centered, their experiences are centered, and the entire infrastructure of civil rights and human rights, I'm talking in the US context, is centered around them. That's called privilege, right? And I think that this is really important for people to understand that. And that doesn't mean that there isn't anti-Semitism in the more traditional historic experiences that Jews have experienced vis-a-vis Europe and vis-a-vis white Christian nationalists. And it's not as if the two are mutually exclusive. But I think it's very important for Jewish American communities in the United States, and I think the young generation understands it, the Jewish Voice for Peace members, the If Not Now members, the anti-Zionist Jewish Americans understand it, most of whom are under the age of 35, the bulk of their membership, that they are privileged vis-a-vis their Muslim, their Palestinian, their Arab counterparts and colleagues. And so with privilege comes responsibility, and not the abuse of that privilege to oppress other people, particularly if you also want people to pay attention and to care about the various ways in which your community may be oppressed in the more what we'll call traditional Eurocentric, white nationalist, anti-Semitic form of oppression. So we'll ask, I don't know if you want to
Can I
comment on
just
this.
add to this? Because I know
Yeah.
that so much. Okay, so I just want to add to this also as somebody who identifies as a critical race theorist who thinks about Jews as historically not white. And I know that people might hear this, Sahar, and not know, they feel, well, we're not white. Yeah, you're a minority, and anti-Semitism is real, right? But there is a moment we have to contextualize that. Race is always contextualized. It's not a constant, right? It changes across time. This is what critical race theorists emphasize, that somebody who is not white becomes white. Think of the Italians, think of the Irish in the United States who become white, right? They don't change color, right? But circumstances have changed where that racial category has changed. And so too did Jews become white in the United States. And they're not, the entire Jewish community globally is obviously not white. There's Sephardic Jews, there's Middle Eastern Jews, there's African Jews. And so this is not to elide those distinctions, but to understand that the category of Jew in and of itself in the United States, right, they do become white. At a particular moment in history, in a way that if you are of other descent, you're not white, and in a way that is in contradiction and contravention of the racialization and exclusion of Jews from Europe. It's precisely because Jews are racialized as other, are essentialized, are seen as somehow born with innate, immutable features that make them not to be trusted and part of the national whole, that we see the exclusion of Jews from citizenship in many parts of Europe, where we see the wholesale ghettoization of Jews, including in the Eastern Pale, where we see campaigns that identify them as a fifth pillar in need of annihilation, right? And which leads to wholesale annihilation under the Third Reich. And it's this logic. So I just want to emphasize that to say now that Jews benefit from white privilege in the United States is not to elide any of this incredible, rich texture and history, but one that is also true. This is an and also, right, equation that makes those things true.
No, and I understand that in chapter 2 and 3 of my book talk all about that. But I think the point is that
No, I'm just thinking about the audience. Yeah.
We can't. I think what's happening is many of the people that I speak to are similar to the Palestinian issue abroad internationally, are speaking in anachronistic terms and in contexts that are not even in the United States and also happened in the past. And that is a distraction, right? And I would say the same thing to Arab communities and Middle Eastern communities in other contexts where they're privileged over, say, Black communities, right? And it is, you're right, it is a hierarchy, it's relational. But I think it kind of, I wanted to mention that because it does go to the core of this conflation of anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And it does go to the core of these presumptions of anti-Semitism that are hurled at Palestinian communities, Arab and Muslim communities, with the intent to silence them, to criminalize them, to exclude them from being full and equal members of our society. And so I just think that is something that isn't said enough, and I'm sure will make, me, you, and the center even more infamous for stating. So we have time for one more question before we end. So there were some questions about the role of the Arab states, and whether you want to historicize that or talk about it more in the current time. And things have changed significantly in terms of geopolitics, especially after the Cold War. But let me just make sure that I state this accurately. So one question was related to the role of Egypt, and I want to extend that to the other Arab states. But can you talk about the role and responsibility of Egypt to prevent Israel's genocide when all nations in general and the Arab nations bordering Israel in particular have a moral duty to unite and support Palestinian statehood by all means necessary? Why is Egypt complicit in sustaining the blockade against the Gaza Strip? So what I just read is the question of the attendee. And how would you, this is an opportunity for you to provide some commentary about the role of the Arab states and your analysis of their role, particularly in the current moment.
Okay, I'll start in the present and move backwards. And I'll start by saying that all states, Arab states certainly included, have an obligation, all states who are parties to the Genocide Convention have an obligation to prevent genocide and to punish it. So that this idea that people, I've heard a lot of people saying not enough Palestinians have died, which is also just analytically flawed of thinking about what genocide is. And so therefore it's not a genocide, what is to be done, but the obligation is to prevent it. And so all states have an obligation to prevent it. And in this moment, it means weapons sanctions, it means the diplomatic sanctions, it means mobilization of dropping, humanitarian airdrops of aid now that, Palestinians are starving. And Gaza has made the north, Israel has made the north of Gaza inaccessible even to humanitarian convoys, where 600,000 Palestinians remain and are not allowing food, water, medicine to enter. And so airdrop, right? So all these things that can be done. So I'm just going to say that applies to everybody. Second, I'll also say that the Arab states have been horribly, horribly disappointing. More so because we would expect them to do something. More so because what Israel is doing is not just impacting Palestinians, but is impacting the rest of the Arab world and changing the politics and the balance of power there. We've already seen Israel attack Nabatea in Lebanon, and a significant amount of cross-border attacks in an effort to draw Lebanon into the war and to expand it, which would be in Israel's interest, to expand the war, to have the U.S. become involved, to be able to finish the job under the cover of a massive war, right? Regional war, right? We also see attacks, from what I understand, reported attacks on the Syrian capital, which is to say nothing of the fact that Israel annexed the Golan Heights, where the sovereignty of Syria is not contested, and annexed that territory in contravention of the prohibition of the annexation of territory by force, right? Article 2 of the UN Charter. So all to say is that this is why we expect, not only because of affinity, but we expect the Arab world to mobilize, and it has not. To the extent that the Arab world has done anything, I mean, we can give credit to Jordan, which has been the most forthright in its opposition in declaring this a genocide, being part of the intervention at the ICJ, which has been airdropping foods and makeshift hospitals. We can also, obviously Egypt and Qatar are two of the main parties that are mediating negotiations between Israel and Hamas, in addition to the United States. So it's not that they're not involved, to the extent that, for example, Saudi Arabia has refused to be part of the US-led coalition against the Houthis, even though it's in their interest as well to oppose them, but refuse to enter that US-led coalition. So we see some position in the negation, but it's wholly, wholly, wholly insufficient. Wholly insufficient in this moment of what can be done, especially because for Israel and the United States, right, what they want is the normalization of Israel and the normalization of apartheid with all of these regimes. If they can just make Israel okay with the rest of the Arab world, they can drop the Palestinians from the bottom. And so this is a moment to rescind from the Abraham Accords as a diplomatic move. Egypt has threatened to rescind from Camp David, which is good that they said as much, but they don't necessarily mean it, because that's quite complicated and it would take more years. And they couldn't necessarily do it in the time necessary to stem the Rafah invasion. But know that what the Arab world looks like right now is a complete different configuration of what it's looked like historically. We saw the end, and so here I go back historically. We saw basically the Arab world make clear that there would be no total war of liberation on behalf of the Palestinians against Israel by the 1973 war, when Syria and Egypt make clear in the aftermath of the October 1973 war that they would not fight, that they are going to negotiate to recoup their territories, and that they would not fight that conventional war. Since then, we've seen steadily, especially after the fall of the end of the Cold War and the fall of a bipolar world for a unipolar world, featuring the primacy of the United States, where most of the Arab world has wanted to enter into the U.S. sphere of influence, which means funding, aid, military support, protection, right? And so most of these states have, or just bullying. And most of these states have entered into this U.S. sphere of influence, including the Palestinian Authority, which is why the Palestinian Authority, forget the Arab world, Palestinian Authority, led by Fatah, has been almost silent for the past 5 months. Almost silent, and not at the forefront waging a campaign to end genocide, right? They could be doing so much more, notwithstanding the exception of its staff in New York and Geneva, for example. And so then, finally, what then is this outcome? I think that this bodes ill for the entire Arab world. I mean, the Egyptian government doesn't represent the Egyptian people. The Egyptian people are enduring a counter coup, a counter revolution. And that's not just Egypt, right? Even, think about Bahrain. And when Bahrain enters into the Abraham Accords, they're just as interested in suppressing their protests and the Arab uprisings as they are into entering the U.S. sphere of influence. That this is also about making sure that democracy does not flourish. And it's not flourishing in the name of basically U.S. influence and in the name of protecting Israel. So that you are denying, you are creating a situation. This is not conspiracy. This is just U.S. foreign policy. This is U.S. Mideast policy, right? Of maintaining strong authoritarian regimes who can repress the democratic will of their populations by force in order to maintain stability that best suits the U.S. national interests, including the stability and protection of Israel. And so you have an entire region that's enduring this condition. So Palestinians are not the only victims here of this Arab policy, but it's why we see, continuing campaigns. It's the continuation of the Arab uprisings and the repression. And why, when we talk, especially from the United States, we have to identify a source of the problem as the U.S. itself. And so I urge those who are concerned with freedoms and who consider themselves anti-authoritarian to understand that, your job in the United States is just make sure the U.S. does no harm. And doing no harm means mostly getting out of the region and, ending its aid. And so I know I know that might, I see you laughing, Sahar, but I guess the reason I say this is sometimes the task can feel really daunting when you want to do things over here and over there and in this regime and how they're imprisoning, their dissidents based on, ethnic, racial makeup, whatever it is. Be agentic. Understand where you are and how you could be the most effective.
We hope you enjoyed today's episode of the Race and Rights Podcast. This podcast is hosted by the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, housed at Rutgers Law School, also known as the People's Electric Law School. CSRR engages in research, education, and advocacy on issues that adversely impact the civil and human rights of America's diverse Muslim, Arab, and South Asian communities. We do so through an interfaith, cross-racial, and interdisciplinary approach. To hear additional episodes of the Race and Rights Podcast, check out our pages on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, Amazon Music, and everywhere else podcasts are available. Now, for a deep dive on these issues, visit our website at csrr.rutgers.edu, where you can find policy reports, teach-ins, and news commentary by our over 130 faculty affiliates. To watch our over 80 academic and public policy lectures, subscribe to our YouTube channel at Rutgers Center for Security, Race, and Rights. And on social media, be sure to follow us on Instagram at Rutgers CSRR and on Twitter and Facebook at RUCSRR. Finally, you can financially support the Center for Security, Race, and Rights by going to our website at csrr.rutgers.edu and press the donate button. And please give generously. As always, be well and see you next time.